Well, good Wednesday afternoon, AP Bio teachers and students from Advanced Kentucky. I am pleased to welcome you to our, really probably our final session to help students prepare for the AP Biology exam. I see we've got some late, or not really late arrivals, but I'm admitting people from the waiting room as we do this, but just to remind you that we're thrilled that you're here. We've got a good number of students showing up and quite a few teachers. This is a content review session to go over the mock exam questions that you should have all seen and hopefully tried to answer and hopefully did a good job at answering. We're pleased to have Brittany Cox, who's been a reader for the AP Chem exam and is a AP Bio teacher from Advanced Kentucky. I'm Lou Akampora, and I'll be kind of manning the microphone here, but I'm fundamentally a chemistry and physics teacher, so I might be out of my comfort zone here, but I enjoy learning about biology also. We will have quite a few students, and the students are still showing up, so please do mute your microphones and turn off your video, but I will be monitoring the chat room, so if you have questions, please go ahead and chat them in, and I will relay them to Brittany. This session will be recorded and uploaded to kyap2020.com along with some notes for the exam. So without delay, let me introduce Brittany and turn the helm over to her. Okay, Brittany, I think you're on. And
all right, thank you. Let me share my screen here. Okay. So your teachers and Lou and I spent some time last week discussing what was a good response on the mock exams. And we had several good conversations. We looked at several very good student responses. So the one thing that always comes out in these things is there are points that you almost get, right? And we really want to give them to you. And if it was your teacher, they probably would give them to you. But a reader is not able to do that. So hopefully today we're going to minimize those almost points and make them into points you're actually receiving. If you would like to, it may be helpful for you to access this link as we're going through. This will have the questions and the rubric so that you can flip back and forth instead of just being limited to following me. So if you want to type that into another tab, that will have the scoring guidelines. I'm giving you just a second to get it. Okay. All right, so I just wanted to give you a couple of housekeeping reminders before we go very far into this. These aren't necessarily content related, but if you've forgotten, question 1 is going to be the largest points of your exam, and it's going to be experimental design. So this is always something we study a lot in AP Biology because it is always well represented on the exam. So I'm pretty confident that you've seen many questions that are about evaluating experimental results throughout the year. This one just may look a little different than what you're accustomed to. And then the second one is conceptual analysis. And what I find interesting, so the reader or the College Board has released information that many of the questions have more parts than can reasonably be answered in the allotted amount of time. They say that's okay. They're just trying to give you as many opportunities as possible to demonstrate that you know things. So even if you've not responded to all parts of the question, once your 25 minutes is up, you need to go ahead and upload it, okay? And don't panic if you can't get to all of the parts. There's, if these questions seem more difficult than what you're accustomed to, because they're gonna be more focused on the skill, don't be concerned, because if they're more difficult, it takes fewer points to earn a 3. So don't panic is what I'm saying. A good mindset gets you a long way on the day of the exam. Here are some things that I think you should have. Formula sheet, and you can write on your formula sheet. So if you can't remember when you accept or reject the null hypothesis when you're doing chi-square analysis, write it on your formula sheet. That's the good thing about open notes. Organize notes, and I would flag things that I'm not confident in. Like if you're not confident in the Krebs cycle, put a flag on that. Okay? And rest. Because when you stay up all night and you're cramming, your brain's not going to be able to function as well the next day, and you're going to have a harder time making those connections. So make sure you're well rested. Run the preview. What is the preview called, Lou?
That's a demonstration or a practice site.
Run that and make sure that you're up to date so that you don't have any technical issues the day of the exam. We want to minimize anything that could get in the way of you showing exactly how much you've learned, right? So take the time in these last few days to make sure you have everything in place, okay? Now, this is the other thing. I don't know if you've ever taken open notes tests before, but there is a caution to be attached to an open notes test. You can get so caught up in Googling or looking in your notes that you do not allow yourself to write the answer to the question, okay? So none of the scored part will be what you Google. The scored part will come from original thinking that applies to those situations, okay? So do not spend all of your time looking things up. Look at the parts of the question that you know how to answer without your notes, and then move to notes when you need to. But don't spend all the time researching an answer before at the cost of responding to the question. Okay, and here are just a couple of more rules of thumb that we're going to see how they played out in the responses. So here are things that I want you to look for as we go through. When you're writing FRQs, you need to always be specific. So there were several heartbreaking moments when you said it, they, them, and we couldn't give you the point because we could assume if you meant one it, then you would know what you're talking about. And if you meant another it, then you definitely did not know what you were talking about. So call things by their name. Don't shorten things. So if the graph says maximum rate, you say maximum rate, okay? And add directionality. Don't say it just changes. You need to say it increases or it decreases, okay? Don't just say changes. And then finally, put your units on there because sometimes they can award points just for units. Do not repeat the prompt. Do not write out whole sentences from the prompt. It wastes your time and it makes you seem like you don't know what you're talking about and you're desperate. Don't waste time. Unless they're asked for, diagrams are not scored, and I've not seen them asked for. Don't do list, bullets, etc. And I've written avoid tunnel vision. A lot of times you hone in on one sentence in the question and you just write about that instead of answering the actual question. So I want you to just make sure you're tuned into what that specific question is asking you. And finally, do not contradict yourself. If you write a beautiful response and you've made all the right points and then in the last sentence you say something contradictory, you don't get the points you earned. So make sure you are not contradicting yourself. That happens a lot more than you would think. Task verbs, there are several and you can look them up online. I just pulled some of the most important ones that you're going to see. And the main ones that I want to talk about are identify versus explain. If they ask you to identify, you just have to say what it is, okay? So if they ask me to identify myself, I would just say, I'm Brittany Cox. If they ask explain, you might say, I'm Brittany Cox and I'm here because I teach AP biology, okay? So if it's identify, you just write a short sentence explaining just that. Don't give too much information. Oh, and compare. A lot of times when you're asked to compare, you just talk about one of the things you're supposed to compare. If you only talk about one of the things, you're not getting the point. So make sure you address both. All right. So our first question that we're going to be looking at is the yeast question. It was the first one you answered. So what I'd like you to do is either on the document that I've asked you to open up or here on the right side of my screen, I want us to take just a moment to reread the stimulus up here so we can make sure we all know what we're talking about. So I'm going to give you just a minute or so to reread that prompt. Oh, I've lost my little taskbar. Okay. So when we're looking at this prompt, scientists are studying yeast and you have a number of data here. What you need to make sure is that when you're looking at these two different graphs, okay, that you are looking at labels attached to the graphs, because without the labels, you are not really, it becomes more difficult to answer the question. So we will move to part A. So in part A, we're asked to describe the 3 structural components of RNA nucleotide monomer. Most of you did a fantastic job on this. You needed to say something about the pentose sugar or ribose. You needed to say something about the nitrogenous base, as well as the phosphate group. So I would say most of the responses we looked at did a very good job responding to part A. And then the second part, explain the role of RNA polymerase during transcription, is where we got a little trickier, because we saw things like join nucleotides together, but they didn't designate whether it was RNA or DNA. There wasn't a lot of mention of the bonds that are formed through action of polymerase, or of the base pairing that allows that to happen. So we want to make sure that we give very brief descriptions exactly of what that enzyme does. And that was something that we saw lacking as we read through responses. Part B, identify the dependent variable in the experiments, identify a control group missing from the second experiment, justify the need for the control group in the second experiment. So if you notice, this one has 3 verbs: identify, identify, justify. So this was a 3-point part of the question, okay? So the dependent variable would have been the maximum elongation rate. So we had a lot of people did not write maximum, and that's in fact what you're looking at. If you write the elongation rate, you probably won't get the point unless you have a very generous reader. So that's what I mean when I say be specific. Look at things like that graph label and make sure you're referring to it correctly. So that would have been the dependent variable. The control group, we saw a lot of success in that you would have to look at the yeast in the absence of the amanthin. So it was something from one of these from experiment 1 would have been the control group. And then the last part is you're supposed to discuss the need of a control group. And we saw some beautiful explanations of this, and then we saw some not complete explanations of this. So the control group's role is to show that whatever the experimental variable is actually determining the outcome. Without a control group, you're not sure if the manipulated variable is causing your outcome or if something else is causing the outcome. So you must have that control as a baseline. Part C was another 2-point part. You had to describe and determine, okay, the effect of amanthin on the maximum elongation rate and for the wild type and modified RNA polymerases, and then determine the ratio of the average max elongation rate, okay? And then finally, you needed to state the null hypothesis. Oh, sorry, guys. Sorry, they just woke the dog up. State the null hypothesis for the experiment in figure 1. Provide reasoning to justify the claim that the change in the amino acid sequence in the modified RNA polymerase affected the shape of the active site. Once again, we saw lots of good responses here. The one issue that you guys got into is when you saw sequence in the modified RNA polymerase, you started talking about mutations, but you did not talk about the actual shape change or the denaturation. Some of you did, but some of you missed that just a little bit. So here's what I'd like us to do. I want us to all take a moment, and this is a student response on the left side. This is the scoring guideline on the right side, okay? And this is how the teachers and I went through it the other day as well. So what I want you to do is take just a couple of minutes and read through the scoring criteria. And then you guys, I'm going to score part A out loud with you, and then we're all going to score part B independently, and then I'll talk through the results. Okay, so take just a couple minutes and read through the scoring guideline and read through part A of the student response. Okay, so let's look at the two criteria that we're looking at in this first question. The response includes both of the following criteria: a description that an RNA nucleotide has the following 3 structural components, and it lists them, and an explanation of the role of RNA polymerase. So let's look at student response 1. They say that RNA has a nitrogenous base, a pentose sugar, and a phosphate group. So clearly give them that point. They did a great job. And then secondly, it says the RNA polymerase is an enzyme that goes down the DNA on the template strand and makes an exact copy of the coding strand, but with uracil instead of thymine. It is unchanged of making a copy of the DNA blueprint so that DNA does not have to leave the cell. This is what I'm talking about. They would not have received this point because when they say things like exact copy using the DNA blueprint, they never really specify that an mRNA is being generated. It sounds like they're making an altered DNA. So I'm pretty confident that this student knew what they were talking about, but because of the way they wrote this, they would not receive the point. So that's the whole purpose of today, is to make sure that we don't miss any points that we definitely knew the answer for. So guys, does that make sense? Throw a Y in the chat box if you understand why that student received 1 point instead of 2. And an N if you don't. Good. Good. Okay, great. So let's look at part B, and I want you guys to read the scoring criteria. It's worth 3 points. And then I want you to read student response to part B. And in just a few moments, I'm going to put Lou or I will put up a polling item so that you can vote on how many points you think the student would have received for part B.
And Brittany, I'll go ahead and, oh, you already launched the poll. So students, this is either 0, 1, 2, or 3 points. And teachers, you're welcome to vote as well, with the poll as well.
There will be some variation. There's even 1 point of variation is acceptable even among the readers at the read. So you could score at 1 point and I could score at 2 points, and it doesn't necessarily mean either of us are wrong. There's some wiggle room there depending on someone's professional judgment. We have about half of the votes in, so if you could go ahead and make a decision, that would be great.
And if you do not see a polling window, if you'll go over to the participant and click over there, there should be an option to let you show a polling window. I think that is part of the problem I've learned about Zoom, is that sometimes the polling window just doesn't show up.
All right, I'm going to give you about 3 more seconds. Okay, so we have the vast majority at about 48% awarding 2 points, which I tend to agree with. So let's look at part B. They said that the dependent variable is the elongation rate. I'm very concerned that the student would not receive that they would need to stipulate that is the maximum elongation rate, okay? So make sure that you don't lose a point just because you didn't write 1 word, all right? The second point, the control group is missing, is the one without the amantin. So that's not the most scientific sounding description, but that is what a control group is. It's the one that doesn't have the treatment, okay? So I would have given that point. And then the last one, the need for this is because you need to see what it is like without the amantin, to see what it is like without the inhibitor, and see the normal rate of elongation. So if at the very end they talk about elongation, so I think they would receive this point. However, if they had only said it, and just said the normal or something like that without that last phrase, I think they would not have gotten the point because they weren't making it clear. So cautious on the pronouns. All right, so I think that's a strong 2-point response. Let's do the same thing for part C. So read the scoring criteria for part C, and then read the student response for part C, and then we will go from there. And if you have any questions about what we just did on part B, feel free to type those in the chat box. You will not hurt my feelings. And part C is worth 2 points. So you're scoring 0, 1, or 2. Okay, let's go ahead and conclude the polling.
We've got about 69% of the vote in, which is better than we do in most presidential elections. So I guess that's pretty good, Brittany.
Yeah, these guys are always awesome. Love biology students. So this one is kind of tricky, is what I will lead with. If you look back, it says you have to describe the effect of the amantine on the maximum elongation rates for the wild type as well as the modified RNA polymerase. So when we look at our scoring criteria down here, it says that we must say a description that amantine decreases the maximum rate for the wild strain and does not affect the rate in the experimental strain. Our student says the amantine decreases the elongation rate and the modified RNA polymerase by inhibiting it. So they didn't do that. They didn't say one stays the same and one decreases. So they would not receive that point. And then the second part, they flipped their ratio. The ratio should be 1:6 or 1/6, and you cannot do them out of order. So a ratio must be written in the correct order. So the student would actually receive 0 points for part C, which is sad because I do think this student knows what they're talking about. I think this is another instance of not reading the question carefully enough. Do we have any questions on that one? Do a Y if you have a question, or ask the question if you do, and put an N if you do not have a question. Sorry, Lou.
That's okay. That is tough because the student comes close, but unfortunately, or the way these are scored, you can't earn half a point for only answering half the question. So make sure you address, if you're asked to address both parts of the question, make sure your response does that.
Yeah, and there are so few points on the exam this year. We need to get all of them that we can, and especially the ones that are, I think this student probably knew that one decreased and the other one did not. They just did not fully articulate that. All right.
Exactly, and sometimes it might be, well, if it didn't change, I don't need to mention it, but yes, you do need to mention it.
Yep, you do. You got to address all parts. So take just a minute, guys, read part D, and then look through the students part D and see how many of the 2 possible points you would award this student. So 0, 1, or 2 points possible. Oh, sorry, guys. Okay. Let's look at it. Okay, so 0, 1, or 2 points. Let's look at the first point. They had to provide the null hypothesis that RNA polymerase would not affect the maximum elongation rate. This is another one that makes me very, very sad because the student says, if it is added to both the wild strain and the experimental group, then the 2 strands will grow at the same rate. So that could mean that they will grow at the rate they grew previously, meaning that neither will be affected. And if that's what the student meant, then their thinking is correct. Or it could in fact mean that they think the wild type and the mutant will grow at the exact same rate, will grow at identical rates to one another with the treatment. And because there's ambiguity in that question, you can't give the point because the student, if they meant this, then they would get the point. But if they meant this, they would not. And we can't ask the student, which one did you mean? Okay, so that's the sad one here. Then in the bottom, they say if the DNA strand is changed, then the mRNA will be read by the ribosome and the codon will code for a different amino acid and the enzyme will have a different shape, changing the active site. They absolutely get that point. They did a really good job explaining that. What we did see, though, is a lot of people stopped writing there where it says enzyme, and they never wrapped it back around to the shape change and the active site. So without that, the rest of the response would have not gotten the point. That was the most important part. So this would have been 1 point on part D. Give me a Y if you have any or if you're good with that. Give me an N if you have any questions about why the student did or did not score the point, or just any questions you have that would help you write these FRQs more effectively. Thank you guys for being so engaged. So as we're looking at the second question, the second student response, I'd like you to read parts A and B and give us a total score out of 5 for parts A and B. Okay, so you're going to score part A and B and give us a total score out of 5. You can start now.
I'm going to edit our polling here so that I can have up to 5 points. So give me just a minute here, Brittany.
Okay.
Surprise me on this one here.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'm a rebel.
I can do this, I think. All right. Oh, that didn't work.
Well, he didn't score 5 points, so it's okay. We'll just score it out of 4.
Okay.
It's fine. So you are combining parts A and B. The student could have scored a total of 5 points.
Put a 0 if you think they earned 5, because no one is going to get a 0.
That's fine. We have about 50% voting. I'd like to see that go up a little bit more before we move on. You guys have been pulling a solid 70. Okay. So I'm with you guys. The results here indicate, well, you're a little off. They're kind of spread. I would be between giving this student a 3 or a 4. I think that they hands down identify or earn the points in part A. I think they earned both of those points very well. And then in part B, they don't get the point for elongation rate because they didn't say maximum elongation rate. Then for identifying the control group, they said wild strain and experimental strain grown in normal conditions. Now, normal can mean a lot of things in science. So try not to use normal. A better response would have been grown without the amantin, okay? Grown in the absence of the amantin, or grown in experiment 1. So I could see them getting that point or not getting that point. But then they do a really nice job, I think, describing what a control group does, okay? So it's showing us that there is a significant difference. I think they do a good job. even though they didn't need all of that information. So I think this student earned a solid 3 or 4, depending if you give them that normal point. Okay. Anyone want to talk about something there? It's okay. Just type it in the chat box. We'll go for it. You guys good? Okay.
I think we're good.
All right. Okay. So we're going to move on to question 2, which is the AdvKY question. So in this one, we're looking at this little crustacean and more or less. I'm sorry, I'm trying to make this poll go away and it won't do it. There it goes. So AdvKY is a tiny crustacean that is aquatic, and it's saying that this crest on top of its head can have different sizes based on whether or not it grows in this chemical Q, is the premise of the question. And then you have the different parts. So A says, describe the factors that influence an individual's phenotype. And you can pull this from the text, or that may be something you just know, okay? That's the classic nature nurture. So it's the genes and the environment that affect the organism's phenotype, the genes and the environment. Explain how the presence of notonecta chemical cues affect gene expression in AdvKY. So here's a problem we had too. People just said the crest gets bigger. You really want to say that the presence increases gene expression associated, which causes a larger height of the crest, okay? So you want to make sure that you take it all the way back to gene expression, since that's what they're asking for. So read part C. So part C, ask us to predict what's going to happen with this next generation when it's grown outside the presence of the predator. And lots of people were drawn to saying that it's going to be smaller than the parent or less than the parent or decreased, which I understand based on the wording of the question. However, what they really wanted you to say, what they really would have liked for you to have said is that those new offspring will resemble the original population. So they will go back to their grandparent generation, more or less, and look like them, okay? And then part D is a 2-point part. You're asked to provide reasoning to justify your prediction in part C, okay? So the reasons you would say is the parents only had the phenotype affected, that being exposed to that did not change their genes, right? So I always give the students the example of hair color. Like I could dye my hair pink and my appearance is going to look way different, but I'm not going to have a pink-haired baby as a result. That is a non-passable trait, non-inheritable trait. So even though the crest size increased, that does not mean that they will have offspring with the increased size. The size of the offspring's crest will be controlled more by those environmental factors. The reasoning that because there was no change and that's what I just said. So those are very similar responses. Yeah, because they don't have, they'll look like normal, right? So let's look at a student response together. And for this first one, I want you guys to just score part A. see if you think the student has earned the point for part A.
So this will be either a 0 or a 1.
Yes. All right, we're at about a 70% participation, so I think we can move ahead. 76% of you said that the chemicals are determining the crust height. So that would not receive a point because they only talk about the environment. They do not go back to that genetic component. So you have to have both. B, I would give them that point. Okay, they're talking about the chemical results in gene expression, I think. Yeah. The size of the crust of the offspring will be smaller than the parent. We as teachers, as we were, oh, sorry, Lou. I didn't even let you guys score the rest of it. So I already gave you A and B. Let's score C. You guys score C, and then we'll come back together to vote on it. My brain doesn't work as well at home as it does at work. Just going on with it.
So this is a score only for part C, which will be either a 0 or a 1.
Yes. We're at about 63% voting, so just a couple more seconds.
All right, let's.
So this one, if you are very strict about the original population, like it says in the rubric, then they would not earn this point. However, us as a group of scoring biology educators last week did want to give that point to the student. So 0 if you're a stickler, 1 if you're not, right? But this student would probably not have gotten the point if the scoring rubric was written that way. I would have given it to them though. Okay, and now let's do part D. You're going to score part D, then we will vote. It is also a 1-point question. So read part D, read the criteria, and see what you think.
And this looks like a pretty even split. So let's take a look at this.
Yeah, pretty even split. I have to say, I would not give that point. Based on the rubric criteria, this response doesn't talk anything about the parents' genetic makeup. It doesn't say that the genes were unchanged, so they still passed on the same genes. It only discusses the environmental factor on the crest. But here's another problem. Even if they had included parental information, they use this word need, okay? Do organisms evolve whatever they need? Like if an organism needs something new, can it just change and have that? So type a Y or an N in the box. Can an organism change because it needs something? Good. Lots of N's. Can you tell me the name of the scientist who believed that organisms could change because they needed to change to be more successful? Anyone know? I'll be really proud of you if you do. It's not Darwin. It was Lamarck. It was Lamarck. Lou, you sneaky.
Yes. I'm
Yes.
not a biologist.
But I told you that last week.
All right. You credit me with having a much better memory than I really have, Brittany.
So the need is what gets you into trouble here, right? We can't change just because we need to change. Well, organisms can't. Humans can change a lot. So there's that. Never say need. Never. Okay, so let's look at response 2. And I want you to score parts A and B together this time. So that will be out of 2 total points. Score parts A and B together, please. We need some like funky Jeopardy music to play while we're polling.
I'm sorry, Brittany, you broke up a little bit on that.
I said we need some Jeopardy music to play during polling.
I can they're all, the students are all cringing right now, so I'll stop that. There's a very generous student or teacher giving this response 3 points, but that's only A or B play, only 2 points possible. So 0, 1, or 2. I hope this person's my secret Santa.
Right? I like that person.
Oh, again, we've got a pretty good horse race here.
Yeah.
All right, I think we've got almost over half the responses. There we go.
Good. So if you look at part A, they say that there's DNA, so that's the genetics piece, and then there's the environment. Okay, so I would give them that point for part A, no problem. Part B, it makes the gene to be expressed at a much higher rate. That's all they needed, okay? So I also want you to know that's not a great sentence. It makes the gene to be expressed at a much higher rate, but it clearly communicates the student's intent, okay? So this doesn't have to be like beautiful prose. It just needs to be direct. Let's look at C and D together too. A and B, he got 2 of the points. So far, he's 2 for 2.
So that was a 2-point response.
Yes, that was a 2-point response.
And C and D will be either a 0, 1, or 2.
Yes.
And a little bit less reading here, so I think we have results that came in pretty quickly. I'm going to end the polling here. And there's what you have.
Yeah. It'll be the normal size. That's a tricky one. I think it would once again depend on how specific your reader is. So I'll give them a maybe 1 on part C. Maybe they did it. Maybe they didn't. D, since the new organisms are not in an environment with the prey, they have no need to be bigger. That's a problem because of need. And once again, they did not mention the genetic piece of that answer. So at the best, the student has earned a 1 out of those 2 points, or it could be that the student didn't earn either of those 2 points, okay? But I want you to notice something here. You could have written a very good response to this question in about 4 sentences, maybe 5. It did not take a whole lot. There are some question parts that you have to write several sentences for each letter, and you're still getting the same point. So the short points where you just say it'll resemble the original population, they count just as much as the points you have to write 3 sentences for. So make sure you're picking up that easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit, and you're responding in a specific enough way that you're getting credit for your thinking. Lou, are we going to keep going?
I think we should look at the last one as quickly. I know we're right at an hour, but Brittany, I'll just mention that, and some of the students and teachers may know that I've read AP chemistry exams for many, many years. And we see the same thing, that the students who seem to be on the right track, the biggest problems are that they don't answer all of the question. They either fail to address parts of the question or they lack specificity. So students, as you look at some of these sample responses, and maybe you can see some of your own work in there, and hopefully not, but when Monday comes along, take the time to read the question and make sure you address every part of the question and be specific. Don't write in broad generalities, because that is not going to earn credit. So let's take a look at this third question, and then very quickly, and maybe we can just look at 1 or 2, Brittany, and go over some common errors that you might see.
Okay. So this last question, lots of information is given in the prompt. You have the table to make sense of, and here's what we realized when reading it is this SLC 3A1 and SLC 7A9 becomes very difficult as you're writing about it because they're easy to mix up. So for our purposes, I'm going to call them 1 and 9. But in writing this one, that would be an easy place to make a mistake, is you're mixing up that alphabet soup, okay? A, identify the individual who most likely exhibits symptoms. That's individual 1. They have the most cysteine in their urine, and they are double negative there. Describe the relationship between the total number of mutant alleles in an individual and the concentration of the cysteine in the urine. The more mutant alleles they have, the more cysteine they have. That's a direct relationship. They increase together. Part C. Evaluate the hypothesis that mutations in number 9 have a greater effect on transport of the cysteine across the plasma membrane than do mutations in number 1. Okay, so you had to get all the parts. You had to say this hypothesis is not supported. And there was a lot of talk about how we should not say a hypothesis is wrong. You should either say this hypothesis is supported or not supported by the data. Okay. So this hypothesis is not supported. While the individual with a single allele for 9 has a higher concentration than the individual with a single allele for 1, the individual with 2 mutants for 9 does not have a higher concentration than the one of the individuals with 2 mutant ones. So we, after much thought, our group consensus was a lot of people only compared that single point when they had 1 mutant allele, and they did not compare as well the one with 2 mutant alleles. Because if you did not evaluate both of those relationships, the ones where they just had 1 mutant and the one where they had both mutants, then there was no way to make an accurate statement of this. And this was a very difficult part. So that's what I mean. This point that required a lot of thinking and a lot of writing is the same point as environmental and genetic influence your phenotype. So let's look at part D, the last part. Explain how the data support the claim that cysteine is a large polar molecule. It's because it builds up in the urine when the proteins are mutated. So the channel is no longer working. If it's large and polar, it needs a channel because it can't just diffuse across the membrane, okay? And notice how this question has tapped into knowledge about transport, polarity, genetic expression, scientific theory, scientific method, all at once. That's to be expected. It's all about connecting those things, and don't get so focused on one part that you forget the rest. Let's look at this one student. Should we just do it together, Lou, or should we poll it?
Let's poll it, but let's just do all 4 parts together, and then you can walk through and see where the points were earned. How does that sound?
That sounds good. So you guys go ahead and score all 4 points. So parts A, B, and C of the student response. We're at about 50%, guys. Can we get just a few more votes?
All right, I think that's pretty good. So I'll end the polling here. And
okay.
So
majority on 2 points. Pretty close between 2 and 3. I believe I would have given this individual a 3. They definitely earned the point for number 1. The individual who most likely exhibits is individual 1. And then they did not need that second sentence or the rest of that second clause. They just needed the first part because it was an identify. As the total number of mutant alleles present in an individual increases, the concentration of cysteine in the urine of the individual increases. So that is also correct. They identify that positive correlation. And then in part, they've labeled this part C, but they really respond to part D in this part. So I would give them the point for demonstrating that cysteine is a large polar molecule. So I would give them 3 points. And they really didn't attempt part C. And it doesn't matter. If you mislabel them, if you answer D in part A, they still give you credit. Questions? All right. Oops. And then this was another one. This is the one, in the end, I believe that the student did not get the point. And I want you to just look at part C and read through that, because the student actually goes back and contradicts themselves at the end. And this was one that we had to read multiple times to try to see if the student was correct or not. So this is what I mean. Like, you can definitely do too much and end up crossing yourself up. So C, we ultimately decided would not have received the point because of the contradiction. And I've really appreciated working with you guys today. Take care of yourselves before the test. You've got this. You're going to do a fantastic job.
I think, and the exams will be different this year. I know everything's going to be is different, but I think students who are prepared, and that certainly includes most of you, you guys have some real stamina. We've been at this for over an hour. We'll do well. And they test questions, you know, the College Board and the people who write and score these questions are aware of everything that's going on. There are some sample questions that are more in the mold of this year's exams on the College Board website, and I would urge you to look at those. And there are videos prepared by the College Board to walk you through those. But as Brittany said, really make sure you're rested and relaxed as best you can on Monday for the exam. And hopefully you'll all do as well as you deserve to.
And this is the URL for that sample question that's more representative of this year's exam. If you guys want to have that for your own use, that URL will take you to it.
All right, well, thank you, Brittany, and thank you, students and teachers. And feel free to contact me. This is Lou Akampora at lakampora@kstc.com. I think that's posted many places, but otherwise, do have a terrific rest of the afternoon. It's a little bit rainy here in Louisville, so I won't be getting out, but hopefully it might be nicer where you guys are. But relax and look forward to the challenge of the exam and the course. So thank you so much, and I will sign off now.